All right, part 2 of the anxious avoidant dynamic. Now we're getting to stage 3 of the relationship between the anxious and avoidant, and this is where both people are heavily triggered. But because neither person really understands their attachment style or understands the deeper meanings to why these things are happening, all each person is feeling on the surface is just triggers, overwhelm, emotions, feelings, wanting to escape how they feel. The anxious person is going to try to escape how they're feeling by getting more reassurance from the avoidant. The avoidant is going to try to escape how they're feeling by getting some type of dopamine from outside sources. This is where a lot of protest behavior comes into play. So the avoidant's protest behavior is that they're going to essentially kind of flip this switch into not really caring anymore because they feel so overwhelmed and they are so afraid of conflict that they really don't know how to address things with the anxious person anymore, because the anxious person tends to be very reactive and emotional, which is extremely triggering to the avoidant. So the avoidant's protest behavior is that they are going to start taking space and they are really not going to let the anxious person know about it. Like they're just going to start pulling away, shutting their phone off and doing whatever they want, because at this point the avoidant is extremely resentful. They have had a lot of things building up inside their head that they have not known how to say, and they are feeling essentially that they cannot take it anymore. The anxious person's protest behavior is often going to look like a lot of passive aggression because the anxious person doesn't understand why the avoidant has been pulling away, and the anxious person doesn't usually realize like how their behaviors are coming across. They start using passive aggression to try to like show the avoidant how they're feeling without saying it. Maybe the avoidant like takes some space that weekend and kind of shuts off their phone. So the anxious person might send them a text being like, "Oh, I see you fell asleep again," and then sending like a thumbs up emoji, which at some point the avoidant is going to read that and be like, "Fuck this shit," which is essentially going to make the avoidant want to stay away even more because now they feel like the anxious person is mad at them and they really, really don't like conflict. Another protest behavior from both people is like cutting remarks. This stems from essentially both people being extremely resentful, not having their needs met, kind of going below the belt because they have become extremely reactionary. So maybe the anxious person comes to the avoidant and is like, "You're not attracted to me, you never want to have sex with me anymore, like why don't you just go watch your porn like you do every night?" And the avoidant might say something like, "At least when I watch porn, I don't have someone nagging me all the time." At this point in the relationship, things are essentially doomed because, and this is why couples counseling is so beneficial in the beginning before a lot of these huge hurdles start happening, because when you have people with insecure attachment, a lot of times what the people end up having conflict over are very surface things when really they should be discussing the deeper levels of what's going on. But if you have insecure attachment, you have a hard time accessing what is actually really going on underneath. But they don't really have access to that a lot of times. And so they end up having conflict over very small things that don't matter. So then what ends up happening at this last stage of the relationship is that the anxious person is just like a debilitated, crippled mess. They have probably neglected a lot of things in their own life. And even if they're desperately trying to maintain their independence, they're having a very hard time because they are fixated on the relationship and trying to make things go back to how they were in the beginning, but they don't really understand what is realistically happening. And the anxious person keeps trying harder and harder to gain the avoidant's approval or make something work. And they're taking everything very personally. The avoidant is at the phase where they see how crippled the anxious person is, and there's a lot going on in the avoidant's mind. They are feeling engulfed by the relentless needs of the anxious person, but at the same time, they're also feeling very ashamed because they like to be viewed as strong and capable, and they feel like they don't know how to be a good partner to the anxious person because they struggle so much with vulnerability and intimacy. They've never really known how to express their needs in a very good way, and they don't really know how to be there for the anxious person in the ways that the anxious person needs. And so in order to deal with all those feelings, they're avoidant by nature, so they want to run from those feelings. So they're going to start engaging in escapism. They're going to start looking for outside sources to make them feel better. This is when you're going to start seeing the avoidant engaging in other things in the relationship. And not all avoidants do this to super big extremes. Like not all avoidants cheat and things like that. But you might see some of this going on with some avoidants where they might look outside of the relationship for some relief. So dating apps, cheating, certain types of addictions like gambling, drinking, smoking weed, whatever it might be, to try to like temporarily make themselves feel better because they feel so overwhelmed and they don't know how to communicate that to the anxious person. And so they're just doing whatever they can to try to feel better. For my ex, he started like sports betting, like addictively at the end of our relationship, and I was like, why is he doing this? You will also see them at this point in time, and a little bit before that too, slowing down with like the intimacy sex aspect, and it might get to the point where you guys are having no sex at all, and the avoidant is often engaging in a lot of porn usage, because the avoidant really struggles with like deep vulnerable connection. That's really hard for them, and it gives them this pressured, obligated feeling that is super difficult. Sex for them is more like a stress release. It's more like a kind of dopamine seeking activity. So when the relationship becomes more connected and more intimate, and the anxious person starts having more needs from the avoidant starts feeling more and more uncomfortable with the idea of having sex, because it starts to feel obligatory and it starts to feel scary. But they still have that underlying desire and that underlying urge, and so they will look for sources where they don't have to engage in any intimacy in order to get off. This, of course, is something that the anxious person is understandably going to take personally, because when your partner stops having sex with you, you start wondering if they're cheating on you, or if something else is going on. You start wondering if you got ugly, or if something happened where they're just not attracted to you anymore. And so the anxious person gets even more anxious, because now there's this other level where like they can't even connect during sex anymore, which is something that anxious people often use to gain validation. Like when you can't gain validation any other way in the relationship, anxious people will often resort to sex, because at least during sex you can feel connected. The last stage of the relationship is usually where all options have been exhausted. The avoidant has tried to seek relief from outside sources, but it's not working. Or the anxious person is so incredibly anxious that they can't take it anymore. So at this point, one of those people is going to end the relationship. Oftentimes it's going to be the avoidant, because anxious people tend to hang on through it all. Like we will neglect our own needs and literally keep hanging on. But the avoidant person can't take the overwhelm anymore. They're just like, you are a shell of a person now, and I can't even look at you without feeling shame. So I need to end this relationship, because I can't be around this. It's causing me so much anxiety. So then one day the avoidant will kind of abruptly break things off, and it will feel very abrupt to the anxious person, because the avoidant hasn't really been communicating very much during the relationship. But if you look back on the relationship in a realistic lens, in the way I'm talking about it through these videos, I bet you can see the way that everything started crumbling brick by brick, and it wasn't as abrupt as maybe you thought it was. Now, in part 3, I will discuss what happens after the relationship ends, and if the avoidant ever comes back, or why they would come back, why they watch your stories, things like that.